Today we're reading Sally Rooney's new novel Intermezzo in less than 24 hours. Or, well, we're gonna try. I'm a little nervous about it. My whole life I've been told like I'm a very fast reader, so I feel like that's part of my identity, but if I'm not really actually that fast of a reader, then I might have to find another personality trait. This is an existential video for me, clearly. If you don't know me, my name is Kat. We talk books here because it is kind of my only hobby and I don't really go outside. This is the arc of Intermezzo. It is out September 24th, so mark your calendars if you're a Sally Rooney girly, which I am. I actually have like 3 copies of Beautiful World, Where Are You?, which technically I have read 26 pages of it already, and I guess you could call that cheating, but I read it before I had the idea to do this vlog in like a 24-hour format. But of the 26 pages that I read, I was already really excited. I mentioned in a previous video that this book seems very different from her other works, but the themes that she's building upon are very similar. If you don't know what Intermezzo is about, it is about 2 brothers grieving the recent loss of their dad. The older brother, Peter, is a successful lawyer, but internally and love life wise, he is a complete mess. The younger brother, Ivan, is a competitive chess player. He's very socially awkward. So they have a kind of complicated and layered relationship where there are a lot of feelings that have been simmering for a long time. And I think the death of their father will force them to confront these feelings. She's only written from the POV of female main characters in the past. She did kind of have male perspectives in Beautiful World, but that was more like third person, like very detached. And I think this is a little bit more in their head. I'm kind of nervous about this. It feels like a test. I have like overachiever PTSD. But anyway, I'm gonna start a timer now for 23 hours and 59 minutes. It will not let me set it for just like 24 hours. This is the max that it goes. You know, that 1 minute will probably make or break it. So if I don't finish it, you know, that's why. All right, let's start. About 20 hours left and I'm about a third of my way through the book, which I think I'm making pretty good progress. I forgot that most of Sally Rooney's novels are dialogue, which makes it really fast to read. Peter is on a lot of drugs, and so I think his inner thoughts reflect that. His narration reflects how fragmented he is inside and how conflicted he is. Her prose feels more fragmented, it's more experimental. Ivan's narration, it's more true to her other novels like Beautiful World, Where Are You? And Normal People. It feels more like that, and it definitely showcases the differences between these characters, their personalities, and their inner world. I think you can really tell that this is her most mature work in terms of her experimentation with the prose and her mastery of the prose. I think Beautiful World has some really beautiful imagery in it, but I am really struck with the imagery in Intermezzo. Sally Rooney is not a writer known for flowery prose, so when she does create beautiful imagery, I think in its simplicity it just really stays with you. I also want to talk about the way that she writes the intimacy and the romantic relationships. The way that Sally Rooney writes men who are in love, they are so down bad, and I eat it up every time. I love it so much. There are 3 main romantic relationships in this novel. The first one is between Peter and Naomi, who is a much younger college student, and that is an interesting dynamic because there's a bit of a transactional nature to it, but obviously there's also care as well. And then there is Peter and Sylvie is his first love, and they have a very intense emotional and intellectual connection. But because of something really awful that happened to Sylvie, it drove them apart romantically, and now they're in each other's lives, but they're not technically together, but they are friends, but they're also more than friends. They're basically each other's soulmates, but they're not together. And this isn't really a spoiler because you find out within a couple pages, but Sylvie has this chronic pain from an accident where she can no longer have sex. And as the book progresses, you learn more about how that drove them apart. I found the way that Sally Rooney writes about that really powerful. I think, you know, in the past, like in conversations with friends, she wrote about the main character having endometriosis, and disorders or illnesses that affect women's health and make sex painful. It's an experience that is so common to so many women, but I don't think it's really talked about enough in literature or media. So I love that Sally Rooney writes about it in such empathetic and frank ways as well. Like she's not shy about how much of a toll it can take on the relationship in this novel. So I am really loving the relationship between Peter and Sylvie. I think there are some lines in there that like I said, made me cry because I feel like the way she writes their connection feels just so beautiful. Like she writes about love so beautifully. And I don't want to read any of the passages because I want you to read the book and to get the full emotional impact of the passages, but there are some lines in there that I definitely need to go back and highlight. And along the same vein, I really love how Sally Rooney writes about these small quiet moments between people, whether it's romantic or platonic. There is a scene between Margaret, who is the older woman that Ivan gets involved with, and one of her friends, and I don't know, I just loved how she captured like sitting at your friend's house and just chatting with your friend. Like such a common experience, but when you pause to really consider like how beautiful that moment can be, it's really nice. And then moving on to the relationship between Ivan and Margaret. Ivan, who is the younger brother, and Margaret, who is an older woman he meets through this chess tournament. I really like Ivan's narration and his point of view because he is such like a tender and sweet and vulnerable character, and he's only 22 and Margaret is 36, so there's this big age difference, and he's also never felt comfortable in his own skin around other people. He has a lot of social anxiety and awkwardness, which I can definitely relate to, so a lot of his thoughts feel like lifted from my own head, which is like Sally Rooney has an uncanny ability to write things that feel like they came from my own mind. But I really like his character and I find him extremely empathetic. I also just love how she writes such vulnerable male characters because I feel like as a woman sometimes it can be difficult to imagine men being vulnerable and having the same kinds of anxieties that you as a woman would have, because when you have experiences with men who take advantage of these kinds of insecurities you have, it's like then maybe kind of difficult to imagine that a man could have like the same insecurities around intimacy, for example, which Ivan definitely does. So it is in a way like humanizing, which feels like kind of silly to say, but I feel like in this day and age, especially this generation, there's a lot of animosity between men and women because of women becoming more empowered, and then like the reaction to that from men who are not invested in women's empowerment. So when you're on the internet a lot and you see that a lot, then sometimes it can make you feel like really awful. But Sally Rooney has this really wonderful way of writing about perhaps a man doing something that we might perceive as like really shitty, like Peter dating this much younger college student and kind of like paying her money, but like not, like it's kind of weird. But I like that when you read her book, you can see like, yeah, maybe that's like kind of weird, but there are like all these reasons that this happens, and they're very human reasons. And I like that she gives this character so much dimension. Like you have this like kind of stereotypical thing for a man to do, like dating a younger woman and like spending a lot of money on her, but then also this like really exquisite, tender, and anguished love that he has for his first love. There is a lot of dimensionality to these characters, and I really love that. I really love how she writes her men because they are so vulnerable and they are so imperfect, but they also feel so realistic, and you get so much of their perspective in this novel. Ivan in particular is like very emotionally open when he talks to Margaret, and I find that really refreshing because the main plot so far seems to be revolved around these romantic relationships. It is to me, as someone who reads a lot of romance, it is to me reading very much like a romance novel. It's kind of funny to me because like, you know, this is literary fiction, but there is such a distinction in the literary world between literary fiction and genre fiction. Novels are just like Jane Austen novels with different characters. They're just about relationships between men and women, but also how social factors like class and gender play into that. Good morning. I had my 8 hours of sleep, very essential, and I have about 6 hours left on the timer. So I think I'm gonna check my email and stuff really quick and then get back to reading. I am a little bit more than halfway through, so I think I'm making good time, but the clock is ticking down, so I am a little nervous. I've gotten a little bit into part two, but I think I'll talk about that later. I now have under 4 hours left on the timer, and I have finished part two of the book. It is divided into 3 parts, so I have about maybe a little less than a third left. One of the things that is interesting about Intermezzo is that the brothers are actually half Slovakian, so there is this immigrant aspect to the characters that I don't think has been present in her previous novels, and it adds this other layer of angst and trauma to the characters that they maybe don't fully understand, especially the older brother Peter. He has a lot of anger and resentment towards himself and even his dad for being perceived as a foreigner. He tries really, really hard to fit in with this world of rich lawyers, with people who sound like and act like they are from Dublin. So it's really important for him to be normal, and that manifests in ways that are actually very harmful in his relationship with his brother, who he perceives as not normal, and in his relationships with women and how he relates to himself as well. There's a lot of self-hatred there. As an American, I'm not like really familiar with the intricacies of what the immigrant or anti-immigrant sentiment might be in Ireland, but I do understand feeling like you're never going to be seen as you're actually from there and feeling like you're perpetually a foreigner. And to me, Peter really embodies this eldest immigrant child. He also has this like hyper competency kind of thing where he feels like he has to make himself useful. Like with his dad who passed from cancer and he was in a hospital a lot, Peter was the one who was talking to the doctors and trying to understand everything and working with insurance and everything. Another thing I picked up on was the mention of religion. It's something that Sally Rooney has written about in her other books as well. In Conversations with Friends, for example, there's a scene where Frances goes to church and she has this like intense revelatory experience. She also compares her best friend Bobby to Jesus. And there's a bit of that in this novel as well. Like the characters are constantly questioning their relation to God and spirituality, even if they don't necessarily practice Christianity in a traditional way. So there's some very interesting conversations about religion and spirituality in this book that I really appreciated. Oh, hello. Of course, there's also discussions of class because Sally Rooney is a Marxist and she always lets us know in her books what her politics are. Perhaps unsubtly, but I do appreciate it because I find the way her mind works and the way she explains her beliefs through her characters so compelling and interesting. And I also love that she makes her characters very principled but also imperfect, which really reflects, I think, real life. Like people who do have principles often are inconsistent sometimes about like what they believe is right and how they actually act in real life. And so, for example, Peter is this human rights lawyer and he really cares about righteousness, but he's also kind of an asshole in real life. He doesn't really treat the people in his life particularly well. And then there's Ivan, who really cares about the environment and thinks about class and labor in really interesting ways, but he hasn't always understood, for example, like gender politics. So the characters are imperfect, they are principled but imperfect, and they try to live their lives according to their values, but they might not always be successful because they are human. And I think that's a very real struggle that I relate to, and I think a lot of people can relate to. In part two, it gets more into the depiction of grief as well over the passing of their father, and I really like how the grief is not even necessarily the central part of the novels, but it underpins everything that happens. So all of these relationships, their lives falling apart, like all of that is because in part of the grief, but also because of everything leading up to that. And there are also some really beautiful passages about grief, particularly from Ivan's point of view. And I think she portrays so well the conflicting feelings that happen, the intense sadness, the guilt, the anger, but also then this feeling like, oh, they would have wanted me to be happy. And I just really loved reading the internal world that she builds for these characters. I think maybe some people would be like, oh, there's a lot of telling and not showing, which I know is like one of the cardinal sins of writing, but I find that with Sally Rooney, I genuinely just love reading her telling us how the characters are feeling, because the way she describes their thought processes is just so beautiful. And I think it shows a lot about the characters when you see how their thoughts unfurl in their head, because so much of her novels happen inside of the characters' minds. In her other novels, she has touched upon difficult family relationships before, but in my opinion, some of them have been more one-dimensional, or they've been very peripheral to the core of the story. And instead, in this one, we get more sides of the story. For example, in Normal People, you have that difficult relationship between Marianne and her brother. It is a very difficult relationship. Her brother is basically a bully to her. But in this novel, you can kind of see Ivan is the younger brother, and Peter is a much older brother who has not always treated him very well, and in fact has been kind of mean to him. But you understand why from his point of view eventually in the story, because they have a difficult family relationship. Peter does go through something very traumatic in his relationship with Sylvia. So because of that, this is a much more humanizing and dimensional portrait of a difficult family relationship. Another thing I want to mention, which I think a lot of people forget, is that Sally Rooney is really, really funny. I think that Beautiful World and Normal People were not that funny, but Conversations with Friends was actually very funny. Frances had this like very biting, sarcastic, dark humor. And the humor in this book, which is kind of sparing, like it happens in these one-liners throughout the book. Peter, who has an inner monologue where he is kind of an asshole all the time, he's actually very funny, and Ivan's very funny as well, in a different way. But I like that she incorporates the humor into the novel so seamlessly. Like, it really feels like it's part of the characters' personalities. By the time we get to the end of part 2, the characters have basically set into motion these plots because of their behavior, which may or may not be, you know, good behaviors. So I am curious how it will all tie up and where the book is headed, and kind of guess, because usually Sally Rooney likes to write her novels, so there is some sense of reconciliation at the end of her novels. Like, it may not be a total perfect happy ending, but she does like to give her characters a lot of grace and to give them at least a prospect of a happy ending. I think one really big theme is going to be how these characters' romantic relationships are helping them grow individually and with their other relationships as well. You know that saying that you have to love yourself before you can love other people? I feel like this is an argument for the other side of that, which is that loving other people helps you to love yourself. I've always hated that original saying because it feels like if you haven't completely healed yourself, you can't experience like romantic love, and I think that's totally untrue. And that romantic love can actually be really healing for your relationship to yourself and for others. And I think Sally Rooney is really trying to argue that. But at the same time, because everyone is so unhealed, there is a lot of hurting that is happening in these romantic relationships as well. But to me, that feels just so much more like real life. In real life, it's very difficult to like perfectly heal yourself and then go out and find a perfectly healed individual and then you have this perfect romantic love. In reality, people are not perfect, and in the process of loving each other, we can help each other grow. Obviously not an argument for people to put up with other people hurting them because they are unhealed and they're part of the process or whatever. There's also a past relationship in here where, you know, someone has to step away from someone else because of work that the other person had to do on their own. But I think it is a very moving, empathetic portrayal of how messy relationships can be in real life. And even though these relationships are messy and imperfect, that doesn't mean that the love isn't real and it isn't beautiful. I have 3.5 hours left, so I'm gonna make lunch and eat it, and then I will finish up part 3, which I think it's totally doable. I think I got this. finished with about 25 minutes left on the clock. I had an English professor in college who said that you can tell a lot by a writer by how they treat their characters. And I feel like Sally Rooney always extends a lot of grace to her characters. She lets them mess up a lot and horrible things might happen to them, but there is always a chance for redemption. So I really appreciate that about her books, and in particular about Intermezzo, because it does deal with pretty heavy themes of depression and feeling like you've completely messed up your whole life up until this point and feeling like you just can't fix everything, like you're letting people down, especially from Peter's point of view because he is the older brother and he feels this great sense of responsibility. She's touched on mental health in her other novels, but this I think is the most explicit portrayal of it because you're really in his head. Really heartbreaking as well, but unfortunately also very relatable. I think if you've had mental illness, you can probably relate to the characters quite a bit in this book. I guess there should also probably be content warnings for like suicide ideation and stuff like that. Yeah, I know in the beginning I think I said I was enjoying Ivan's POV more because he felt like more innocent, but in the end I did find myself really appreciating Peter's point of view and seeing how much is really behind that like belligerent exterior and what's going on in there. He is a very layered character, they both are. Intermezzo to me feels like her most complete portraits of characters that she's done in any of her novels. I think structure-wise it is really similar to Beautiful World, Where Are You?, where you have these two main characters, but they have these other relationships that help inform their relationship to themselves and help them see and exacerbate and then help them resolve that conflict. So it follows that similar format, but I think it goes much deeper. It is also a much longer book, I think, than Beautiful World, Where Are You?, so that probably helps. I think this is also the book that delves into the interiority of her characters the most, besides maybe Conversations with Friends, which is literally in first person, but this as a third person POV really delves into these characters' inner worlds and builds it out. So in that sense, I felt like the main characters, Peter and Ivan, felt the most complete and the most like real people of her characters that I've read in her other novels. And I felt that their pain and the unspoken feelings between them, there was just so much depth there and so much emotion that I think was portrayed really wonderfully. Because of the grief, the mental illness, the chronic pain, I think this is her heaviest book, exploring the darkest themes in the most depth. And I think she also accomplishes the most in this novel. I can definitely tell it is a more mature work. I think a lot of the ideas that she's been exploring in her previous work are more fully formed in Intermezzo. If I had to distill this book into maybe one or two sentences, I would say it's about the transformative power of love, whether it's to hurt, to heal, or just to change someone. And I think this is something that she has been playing around with for a very long time in all of her novels. There's that ending line of normal people, which is something like, I think people can really change each other, something like that, which I think really is the theme of most of her work. And it certainly is one of the major themes in Intermezzo as well, because these other relationships that Ivan and Peter have really help inform and change their own relationship to each other. I think it's also about broadly the meaning of life and what it means to live a good life or the right life. Peter, for example, has this recurring thought that like he's living the wrong life, he wants to live the right life. And for him, the meaning of that changes over the course of the novel, because in the beginning he's thinking about how to live the right life from the lens of how other people might judge him. And the other characters also have similar thoughts, like Margaret, the older woman that Ivan is seeing, also is dealing with the idea that people might judge her for dating a much younger man. So she's contending with this idea of what it means to live the right life and why something that feels right would be seen as not right by other people, and if that should even matter to her. And so a lot of these characters have these ideas about what it means to be right and to live correctly which change throughout the course of the novel and become something different in the end. And we also see this in the way that Sally Rooney describes really small moments. It's really mundane imagery that she describes in such beauty, and also in the ways that the characters experience spirituality. There's nothing extraordinary that happens in this novel. They're all very normal, kind of domestic things that happen between people, like things that happen every day to normal people. But the characters are constantly finding, seeking, in search of some kind of higher power, spirituality, and questioning things about themselves. So it feels like Sally Rooney is saying something about the beauty of everyday existence, of these relationships that we might take for granted, or these small moments between people that we might take for granted, and that she's saying that this is what the meaning of life really is, and that maybe it's just meant to be experienced. And I think that sentiment and that theme is pretty well expressed in this quote on the back of the arc. This is from Ivan's point of view. "There is more to life than great chess. Okay, great chess is still a part of life, and it can be a very big part, very intense, satisfying, and pleasant to dwell on in the mind's eye, but nonetheless, life contains many things. Life itself, he thinks, every moment of life, is as precious and beautiful as any game of chess ever played, if only you know how to live." And I think it's also really important that Peter and Ivan are both in occupations that are about winning. Peter is a lawyer and Ivan is a chess player. And so their careers are built on winning because they hate losing. And they are both approaching their relationship to each other and with other people as like games to be won at first. And then as the novel progresses, I think there is this loosening of the idea of what winning is and if it even matters and what it means to live the right kind of life. I think you could also argue that all of Sally Rooney's novels are to some extent about miscommunication, or that miscommunication is at the heart of every conflict. I think it's also extremely realistic because I think a lot of conflicts in real life are because of miscommunication. And not even the refusal to communicate or people communicating incorrectly, but the limits of language and the limits of how we can communicate our interiority to other people, because if they don't live the same way that we do, it's very difficult to make them understand through language, which is a human construct and is not it is not expansive enough to describe all of human experience. And so because of the limits of language and communication, there are so many conflicts that arise because we simply don't understand each other. And so I do find the conversations and the dialogue that the characters have in her novels really satisfying, because while they may not be able to fully communicate how they feel or what they're going through, I really appreciate the characters' efforts to try and how realistic the dialogue can sound. I also find it really interesting the difference between like what the characters are thinking and how they talk about other characters when you go into that character's POV, it's like completely different. I'm not sure which of her novels is my favorite at this point, but this definitely feels like, to me, her best work in terms of the character work and the writing itself. But again, the themes are really, really similar to her other novels, and you'll probably recognize a lot of even the characters. I think because it is an iteration of the themes that she's been working with, it feels very, very developed and fleshed out. The pacing also felt incredibly well structured. The entire novel, in fact, felt very well structured. I think if you're a Sally Rooney fan, you'll definitely love it. If you're not, I think you should give it a try because it is different from her other works in terms of the prose and even the way she approaches the subject matter. I think it's most similar to Beautiful World, Where Are You? In terms of the structure. In terms of the relationships, it makes me think of Conversations with Friends because of the age gap, but we all know Sally Rooney loves a good age gap romance. We know that for certain. Oh yeah, speaking of like age gap and stuff like that, there's a lot of intimacy in this. There were at least 5, 6, 7, like there were a lot of sex scenes in this book. proving, I guess, that smut can be literature. And I don't say that ironically. Like, I think there's a time and place for the erotic in literature, and I really like how Sally Rooney blurs the lines and how she writes about intimacy and kink and sex in such an interesting way. In general, I think it's been really wonderful to have been able to read her books in the order that they came out, as they came out, and see how much she's grown as a writer and how her career is evolving. Look how many tabs I have. You can tell I really enjoyed this book. Sally Rooney, you've done it again. I feel like I have more feelings that I haven't fully articulated about the novel, but I'm also like, my mind is just drawing a blank because I literally spent the past 24 hours reading this book and my brain is just completely fried. So I would probably end it here. If you're a Sally Rooney fan, definitely pick it up. I think you'll love it. If you're not a Sally Rooney fan, I think you should pick it up anyway, because if you hate it, it's kind of fun to be a hater. And if you end up liking it, then amazing. It was 448 pages of people having conversations and yearning and basically not doing much else. And I loved it. I ate it up. It was amazing. I'm gonna close it out here so that I can move on with my life, because I really did commit 24 hours to this book. I have no regrets because it was a really good book, but I'm also like, I feel like I have 0 brain cells left. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you stuck all the way through, if you've read Intermezzo, let me know what you think. I would love to know. And if you've read her other novels, I would also love to know what you think. And I will see you next time. Bye!